because there's this idea of using the Sinai as the rubbish bin for Palestinian refugees. It's possible. Like the Egyptians have said that that's a red line, but things can change. That by hook or by crook, Israel will get its way, and maybe, who knows? Maybe the Americans will strong arm the Egyptians to say you've got to accept these Palestinian refugees. Who knows?
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Ralph Leonard is a British-Nigerian writer on international politics, religion, culture, and humanism. He has written a few times for Sublation Magazine, along with Unheard and others. And I'm glad to have him back on to discuss his essay, Israel, Settler Colonial State. Ralph, welcome back to the Diet Soap podcast.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So your essay for Sublation, Israel, a Settler Colonial State, ? Has gotten a lot of attention, and I'm glad to get a chance to discuss it with you. What kind of reactions did you get after the publication of the essay? How has it been taken up from your point of view?
I think, for the most part, it's been quite positive. I think most of the reaction has, liked it in terms of being principled yet nuanced on the question of settler colonialism and how we can apply it to Israel, because I do think that a lot of the times we have this discussion that it is done in a very tendentious or purely rhetorical way instead of actually in a concrete analytical frame. So I wanted this essay to really kind of do it seriously and not kind of as a gimmick or as a cheap kind of rhetorical point. And I think most of the reaction has recognized that. Now, of course, there has been some critical reactions, like some of them have been from Zionists who kind of object to kind of applying settler colonialism to Israel because they kind of feel that A, it's a bit slanderous, or two, that it kind of portrays like the Zionist settlers as white European interlopers, like the British in Kenya, and not as Zionists imagine themselves as Jews returning to their natural and ancestral homeland in order to renew the Jewish nation in Eretz Israel or Palestine. So for the most part, it's positive.
So how should we think about settler colonialism generally? Is it strictly European phenomenon or a project? What defines a settler colonialist endeavor?
Well, settler colonialism, if we want to define it very simply, is the mass movement, if you will, of one people to another piece of territory where another people resides, in order to turn that territory into a new sovereign territory, to erect a new political order onto it. So you can find many examples, in the New World, the United States, Canada, Latin America, mass migration of various waves of Europe, mainly European settlers in that context, to supersede the originally existing native societies and erect a new political order or a new state on the ruins of that original native indigenous society. So it's not just in the New World, you can find it in Australia, New Zealand. And it is important to kind of make a distinction between settler colonialism and, say, ordinary colonialism. And I like to make this distinction in two sense, that colonialism works on the logic of extraction. Like colonists come over to a particular territory and say to the natives, now you work for us. So this was, similar to, how the British Empire operated in like India or in various parts of Africa, that they came and ruled the territory and said to the natives, you now work for us. And while settler colonialism is more interested in the land, not the natives, like their relationship with the natives is for them to go away. And this can happen through various means, whether it's deportation or expulsion, ethnic cleansing, or even genocide. But the point is, they want the land to bring in imported laborers to work from, while colonialism obviously is based on extracting surplus value, and that's what makes Israel or Zionism, the Zionist movement, a settler colonial movement, is that they came to Palestine not really for the purpose of extracting surplus value from the Palestinian Arab peasants, but to have the land to create their own political order out of it. So that's how I would answer that question.
So you, towards the end of your essay, you discuss the rise of nationalism in the 19th century and before, as providing a context for settler colonialism. I believe that would be how I interpret what you're writing there.
Yeah, more about Zionism, particularly as a nationalist.
Yeah, particular. But before before the French Revolution, say, or before the American Revolution, before the kind of birth of republican nations, under the context of empires and the rule of the aristocracy in Europe, was such a thing as settler colonialism possible? And would it be fair to think of the way in which an empire took control over a region to be more colonial, in so much as it was extracting resources from those territories without insisting on changing the character of the region necessarily, or the mode of production?
Well, yeah, because obviously before the American French Revolution, the settler colonialism as a process was already going on in the New World. So there were already, migration of, say, English settlers or Spanish settlers in the States, or what is now the United States, and throughout Latin America. And yes, it's true that at that point, those colonies were still attached to the mother country, to the imperial sovereign. So, the 13 colonies of the States were part of the British Empire, were part of the British Crown. But because of in the late 18th century, where you did have the first national movements, that's when these settler colonies began to develop their own sense of consciousness, independent of the imperial sovereign. So that's where you have the American War of Independence, and then shortly afterwards, the wars of independence in Latin America, and because these places wanted to outgrow their imperial sovereign, and that's a characteristic of settler colonial movements, throughout, history. It's part of the modern history that, even in South Africa, the Boer Wars were, a war by, the Afrikaner settler population against the British Empire. And yeah, that's a characteristic, of settler colonial societies, that they do eventually outgrow their imperial sovereign, or at least want to, if not independence, at least gain a level of autonomy and a level of distinction. So, for example, Australia and New Zealand technically are part of the British Commonwealth, but we obviously understand that there is an Australian nation and society that's distinct from Britain and British society. Even if there is a common sort of cultural and linguistic heritage in the English language, for example.
Right. I'm beginning to see why anti-colonial discourse might sometimes be opposed to Marxism or socialism, because the idea of socialists is that that capitalism and the way it expands throughout the world and brings all these different people together to be workers is ultimately going to be a progressive force. It's going to transform the world for the better and liberate humanity. And an anti-colonial discourse might want to claim that no, this is exploitation, oppression. I think both things are true, and that that we should instead push against the expansion of capital and of what at the beginning were European peoples, and hold people, allow people to remain where they are. Is that a simple-minded dichotomy between the anti-colonial discourse and the Marxist one, do you think?
Yeah, to some extent. There is that kind of view that exists on the left that, if you will, 1492 was a big historical catastrophe, and that the world would have been better off if Columbus didn't rock up in the Americas. But obviously, from the Marxist point of view, 1492 is the beginning of the bourgeois era. That's how that's where the idea, the world market started there. That's where the entire ways of thinking and structure of the world completely transformed at that time, and it was part of the development of a new era of freedom. Because you have this idea that we've had 500 years of racism and oppression and since 1492. That's true. But there's also been 500 years of freedom and liberation as a result of it, and that's a very hard concept to grasp, because it seems very just plain contradictory. How can that be free? How can that produce freedom? But it also looks at or reveals a very tragic aspect of the Marxist vision of history, that history is a tragedy. It's not a morality tale or a melodrama. That I'll put it, even Hegel, I think, put it that slavery was once a necessity for the development of human society. And why slavery? He's talking about antiquity slavery, ancient Greece. Mm-hmm. That part of the tragedy of history was, the freedom of the few, literally and necessarily dependent on the enslavement of the rest. That you would not have Aristotle or the great ancient democracy in Greece without slavery, and the two were very much interlinked. But
there's an old Louis C.K. joke. He does this thing where he says, "Of course, but maybe. Whereas like he'll say something that of course would be like the common view of something, and then the but maybe after what comes after but maybe is some horrible thought that you're not supposed to have. And one of the routines on with that theme is, of course, slavery was a horrible human failure and moral outrage, and absolutely is a blight on the history of the world, and has to be opposed wherever it arises. But maybe all human progress comes down to throwing human beings at a problem without any care for their, health or well-being until the problem is solved. And I think that the aim of socialism is to create a society where you don't have to treat human beings as expendable in order to get a great productive force out of the mass of humanity, where you can have free individuals and massive projects that change the world.
That's what makes the modern world different from the rest, because, and this is a point Hegel makes, that with modernity, the possibility of freedom, universal freedom, is a real possibility. It's not just a fantasy or a religious dream, and that's what makes it distinct from previous epochs. Because in ancient Greece, that was not possible. It literally was not. That slavery was a necessity, unfortunately, and it was a tragedy. But that's part of the tragedy of history, and with the modern world, that the possibility of transcending the slaughterhouse of history is real, and that's, if you will, the task of socialism. And
one thing we can say now is that the occupation of the Palestinian lands and the oppression of the Palestinian people is not a necessity in the way that slavery was for the Greeks, right?
Absolutely.
Right. So, go ahead.
I was just going to try to tie this in with Zionism and Israel as a settler colonial state. That one of the, I suppose, ironies of Zionism is that it started, when it actually started to make a presence in Palestine in the 1880s, that was the time that that colonialism or settler colonialism was just starting to wane. I think because there's two interesting passages that I've read on this, that from Walter Lacure, who was a pro-Zionist historian of Zionism, and by Abraham Leon, who some of your listeners may know, who was a Trotskyist, anti-Zionist, former left Zionist, become anti-Zionist. And they made the point that by the time Zionism came onto the international scene, there was no more empty spaces for that to be used up, because the Europeans had used all of them up. So the conflict with a quote unquote native population would have been probably inevitable wherever the Zionist movement would have planted itself. But it was certainly in Palestine. There was always going to be a conflict there, because you can't erect a Jewish majority state, or as Jabotinsky once put it, turn Palestine into Eretz Israel, or make Palestine as Jewish as England is English, when the land is majority Arab, without there being a confrontation over it.
Right. Well, I'm going to go through I have some thoughts on that I can't quite articulate. But so I'm going to let's go back to the question of settler colonialism. Why is it a significant question whether or not, given what we said at the beginning, that what we're living through now, the development of capitalism, is a tragedy that also creates conditions for freedom? Why is it such a vexed question to to ask whether or not Israel is a settler colonial state, like the United States was, right? Why can't that be taken up as an unfortunate aspect of history and the development of capital, and then be addressed on a more practical level rather than a moral one, do you think?
Well, again, for me, that this question is an analytical question, not a rhetorical, propagandistic one. And it's for me trying to grasp the true character of this conflict, of this question, the Palestine question. And as I do say in the article, that it's not, settler colonialism is one aspect of it, it's one dimension of it, but it's also an unresolved national question. And I think the reason why it does come up, this question of settler colonialism comes up a lot, is, within a lot of the left, that settler colonialism has come to acquire a kind of ontological character to it, that it's the new dialectic of history, that the objective for a lot of the international left is decolonizing Palestine, not fighting for world socialism, for example. And the danger with that is that you do kind of take up a nationalistic frame, that as opposed to a more internationalist frame. And a danger with these kind of decolonial, and I use decolonial to signify the academic literature on this, like Walter Mignolo and those types, that it's really just a kind of cover for a really reactionary ethno-nationalism and nativist restorationism. And I don't really think that that's really going to be a desirable or even possible goal in Israel-Palestine, because of course Israel's not the only settler colonial state, and just because it is a settler colonial state, just because those are its origins, doesn't mean that conditions can change for the better, or that a properly civic, free and freedom can't exist between both Israelis and Palestinians. So, for example, the United States is a settler colonial state, and and in the course of its history, it's committed a much more comprehensive atrocities against the various native tribes than Israel has done to the Palestinians. But just because that's happened doesn't mean, therefore, that the idea that, every American should be buoyed back to wherever place in Europe or beyond Europe that they came from should be a desirable goal. This is where the whole nonsensical idea of Sakai's settlers that, gets taken up on some aspects of the left is just reactionary ethno-nationalism. The idea that each people has their kind of natural homeland that they really belong to, and that each people kind of should exist within their little delineated space, because that's where each nation belongs there. It's a really reactionary, romantic, nationalist idea that was used by anti-Semites in Europe against Jews. Right. That was the whole argument by the integral nationalists in the 19th century, that Jews are racially not of our nation, whether in France during the Dreyfus affair, or in Romania or Poland, that their ancestors are from Zion. They're not of Teutonic origin. If you're German, therefore they're racially not of the nation. They can't exist here. the body politic can't contain them because they're foreign, you know.
Right.
And ironically, Zionism kind of duplicates this reasoning in its own way, because it kind of says, well, actually, yes, we aren't of this nation. We're actually of Palestine. Therefore, we should return back to Palestine, because it understands anti-Semitism. You know, and Jabotinsky has this phrase, the anti-Semitism of things, that which it understands it as a kind of deplorable but rational and understandable reaction of a body politic to a foreign body. And then it says, because Jews were, the abnormal condition of Jews were, they were dispersed across various nations that they did not belong to and did not belong to them. And that's the reason why they're being persecuted. Therefore, the solution be, well, let's return to our natural and organic homeland, which is Palestine, Eretz Israel.
Right. This is one of those instances where I think Slavoj Žižek is helpful, where he says, we should understand that at the foundation of ontology is a gigantic disaster and everything is a mistake. So, you can't return to ontology because the universe exists because something exploded. So there's no home. You can't go home. The interesting thing about the other interesting thing about your article for Sublation was that you walk through the best evidence, some of the main arguments trying to defend Israel from the charge of being a settler colonial state, and then some of the best evidence supporting the idea that it is. And I want to, so we can maybe go over some of the better arguments defending Israel and then the refutations of those, or maybe one. But before we do, why do you think it is that those who want to defend Israel's right to exist feel that it's necessary to defend against the charge of settler colonialism?
Because they think that whenever they see kind of pro-Palestine people or leftists use that accusation of settler colonialism, that they're effectively saying that it's an illegitimate state, that it's fake, or its basis is fundamentally kind of wrong and evil, that should be overturned. And, I'm sure for some of these people that this is like their chance to kind of stop a settler colonial project in its process, because obviously you can't reverse the United States or Canada or the other ones, but Israel's one we might have a chance of reversing. And a lot of the pro-Israel people will kind of see that and think that, oh, this is basically them trying to delegitimize like not just like Israel's right to exist, but also like the Jewish people's national self-determination, that their right to have a piece of territory on this earth that they can claim title to, like just like other nations have their piece of territory that they claim title to, and they think that that's just anti-Semitic and will inevitably put Jews back into galut, exile. So that's why they react that way against it.
And what do you think the strongest argument against the charge is that Israel is settler colonial?
Well, the strongest argument is that it's that Jews were returning to their homeland, not, if you will, they're not like the pilgrims to America, that they were returning to their ancient homeland, the homeland that Judaism valorizes, that the whole idea of one day the Jews will return to Jerusalem. It's a very deep thing within like Judaism, the religion and the culture. And the Zionist movement didn't go to Palestine to found to find a new Vilna or a new Krakow, like the English settlers founded New York or New Amsterdam. They they restored the old Talmudic and biblical name places in Israel when they founded it out. Now obviously some of this is it's a very nationalistic restorationism, but I would respond to that with another example of a settler colonial movement that's very similar to Zionism, Liberia, the Liberian movement, which was of ex-slaves in America, African slaves in America, who wanted to return to Africa where their ancestors came from, and actually some of them were only 1 or 2 generations removed from Africa, so it was a very close it was still quite fresh in their memory, and because through, and it's the arguments are very similar, because that black people, there's no place for black people in white society in America, that white people and black people can't share a common society in America. And this was also an argument of many white abolitionists, even, that the solution to the black problem should be to put them in Liberia or Sierra Leone, and actually in Jewish context, it was an argument of many anti-Semites that, well, the solution to the Jewish question is put the Jews back in Palestine, and we should help them in doing so, because that's their natural homeland. That's where they really belong. And ironically, the Balfour Declaration, which started which was like the international legitimation of the Zionist movement via the British Empire, and the only person to oppose the Balfour Declaration in the British cabinet was Sir Edwin Montagu, who was the only Jewish member. And he saw it as basically saying that, well, the Jews, that it's basically saying that the Jews only really belong in Palestine, and he was an opponent of Zionism, saying that they're trying to mess up the secure position that integration that Jews have had in Britain and in other Western European countries. And he's saying that, well, the Zionists and the anti-Semites kind of agree on this point, and he was really, really strongly opposed to that. So I just wanted to put that in as a footnote. And this is the same with Liberia, and in the process of those, the Americo-Liberians coming back, they also encountered, people who already lived there, who saw them as colonizers, as foreign colonizers. And those Liberians also had, they were very religiously Christian, and they had a certain kind of European influence, Christian influence, kind of colonial type views about, we're going to turn this empty land into a new Jerusalem and stuff like that. So it's a structural argument I'm making, not really a moral one about settler colonialism. That me saying that the Zionist movement structurally was a settler colonial movement is not to deny the historic Jewish connection to the Holy Land, or the history of oppression that Jews had in both Christian and Muslim societies, or is even saying that Israel should be quote unquote abolished or destroyed or any stuff like that. It's just a purely analytical, concrete argument as to the origins of the state.
I feel as though the more damning charge against Israel is that it's an ethno-state, rather than that it's a settler colonial state.
Yeah.
And that there might be political traction there in a way that there isn't on the question of whether it's settler colonial.
Yeah.
But somehow that's not being taken up very much in this moment by the left. Maybe it is, but not by the Marxists that I am arguing with on Twitter.
I think it is, but it's intertwined with the settler colonialism argument to be a kind of, well, Zionism is white European, racial nationalism. So I think they argue in that sense. But
yeah, but that part isn't really true, right? But it is true that it is an ethno state based on Jewish identity.
And Zionism is an ethno-nationalist ideology, right?
Right.
And I make this argument in the piece that you have also part of the, because a lot of things are said about Zionism, and a lot of them are kind of tendentious and just wrong. But in order to truly understand Zionism, you have to understand it as an ethnic nationalist movement and not just as a colonizing enterprise. And that's where I make the point about how it fits into the context of the various waves of nationalism in modern history, because Zionism belongs to kind of 19th century style romantic nationalism that arose in Central and Eastern Europe after the 1848 revolutions. And that's where it arose. Because it's not a coincidence that Zionism arose in the same places where Jews lived in between competing nationalist movements and ideologies. Many of them were also anti-Semitic against them. So then it would logically produce, like, Jews will have their own ethno-nationalism. If the Ukrainians, the Romanians, the Germans, the Poles are having their own nationalisms, why can't we?
Right. And here's a question I wrote down, and I should probably know the answer to it, but you can teach me. Why did the nation of the American and French Revolution give way to these ethno-nationalist movements instead? Why wasn't republicanism, where everyone in a territory had equal citizenship rights and was part of the republic, why wasn't that the dominant form that nationalism took in the 19th century?
Part of it was after the Napoleonic Wars, the defeat of Napoleon, and even during Napoleon's conquest, because German Romanticism, for example, arose in reaction to Napoleon's conquest of Germany, where they made the critique that the universalist ideology of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, is really just an ideological cloak for French conquest of Germany and suppression of German identity and culture. So ironically, the post-colonial critique of the Enlightenment as, universalism masking some kind of racial interest is not really that original.
Right.
It's been said before. So that's one aspect of it. Another is just, the defeat of the French Revolution, because after Napoleon was defeated, the French Revolution, or what was left of the French Revolution in its original phase, was kind of suppressed. And, the Congress of Vienna with Metternich also tried to suppress, like, Republican and liberal movements. So there was that aspect of it. And there was also, like, a general kind of ideological reaction to the Enlightenment, universalism and rationalism through kind of, the romantic reaction, which is, now romanticism is a very broad category, but there was broadly speaking, the critique of the Enlightenment was that it was so abstract and purely rational that it didn't take into account like the concrete and people's kind of primordial emotions and, you know, textured cultural relations. And then you had this development of like cultural nationalism, which took, you know, based around certain things like language. The language was like the expression of a kind of primordial communion with your ancestors. So like when you speak a certain language, you're, you know, you're talking in the same tongue as your ancestors did, and that expresses sort of natural and profound bonds that, say, you know, the people that the French Revolution didn't take into account or kind of ignored. Because I think one Zionist thinker called Max Nordau makes this precise point when he criticized the men of 1792 for their mathematical logic, because he was arguing that when they were in power and, you know, executed their various policies like Jewish emancipation, that they just did it from a very strictly abstract rationalism, and not from a kind of, you know, they didn't really take into account like the reality of, you know, profound ethnic or national bonds that united people. And that was, you know, and this is a common criticism of cosmopolitanism, that they seek to skirt over supposedly deeply entrenched divisions within humanity for a so-called abstract man. You know, and, you know, it reminds me of a quote by de Maistre, who was a counter-enlightenment thinker, that, oh, I've seen Germans, I see Englishmen, I see Frenchmen, but I've never seen a man. You know,
yeah. My counter to that would be when you go to the grocery store or to the mall or to any shop really in the world, you are seeing the products of abstract man.
Yeah.
Because the abstraction of labor power, which is universal now, is coordinating workers around the world to produce products that they couldn't produce in their local area alone. And so those when workers go to work and get a wage and produce goods that are entering the world market, they are that abstract man, or abstract woman.
And also inverts like the 18th century, you know, the American French Revolutionary concept of patria or homeland. Because in the American French Revolutions, the idea of a homeland is not a geographic concept. It's an idea. It's a civic idea that is to be achieved in the future by creating a free civic bourgeois society. That's the patria in those contexts. Whereas in the kind of nationalist movements that arose afterwards, the idea of a homeland then began to take on a very specific geographic quality, that it's about, you know, the concrete land, you know, the landscapes, and people have a kind of unique mystical relationship to their land that they have exclusive title to by virtue of an ancestral historical right, you know. So for example, in the German context, because the Teutonic ancestors were here first on this patch of land, and I apparently descend from them, therefore this land is mine and my own exclusively, because it's the authentic expression of the German national character, you know.
The other day I confessed to Chris Catrone that the only way I can think is through movie references from the 80s. So forgive me here, but James Brown did a song for Rocky IV, where Rocky goes to the USSR and fights a Soviet and wins. And the song is called Living in America. And a lot of the lines are about like the transcontinental highway system, car culture, the power that you have to just go wherever you want without any destination in mind. And it's all about the sort of liberating effects of mass production and modernity and America as a place for individuals to realize themselves in ways they don't even know that they want. Is like there's a line like set out on the highway, you don't know where you're going, but you might find out who you are along the way, something like that. So I feel like that is still in the United States, at least a while ago, part of the ethnic identity of not having one, I think. So
that's the unique thing about America, is that it is the Enlightenment cosmopolitan republic par excellence. That it's not it's based on an idea. It's not really based on a like geographic concept, because and it's not an ethnic or racial, or on principle it's not supposed to be an ethnic or racial or religious basis. Like, to be American, like, is a completely open like identity, and anybody can come in here and be part of, the nation, or the republic, I should say. Because again, America is not really a nation in the kind of the sense that it's known today. It's a republic, which is based on idea.
I mean, obviously, America has failed to live up to its own identities, go over and over again. But nonetheless, if there's something good about it, it's in that James Brown song, about just anyone can take off on the highway, become who they want to be, and you're not tied down to a particular place or a particular way of life necessarily, because of the power of the collective work of all these Americans, which, if you watch the music video, they're heavily, it's like watching a man with a movie camera, only it's 1984 and it's for a Rocky movie. But
and you could
go ahead.
You could say that America's history, in terms of having a highly racialist like aspects to it, that of official white supremacy, is in part like due to the fact that it doesn't really have that kind of rooted ethnic sort of character. So so the only kind of nationalism it's had to rest on has been that kind of white Anglo-Saxon racialism. So that's that's the closest thing you can have to an American ethno-nationalism.
I think that's given way. I mean, not entirely, but it's giving way. So let's talk a little bit about the current political moment. People should go read your essay in full. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.